April 16, 2026. In a cramped office in Warsaw, Poland, the developers at Fumi Games held their breath as the global countdown for their debut title hit zero. For 3 years, they had teased the world with snippets of a nightmare painted in the whimsical, jerky lines of 1930s rubber hose animation, a project that promised to marry the nostalgic warmth of Steamboat Willie with the cold, visceral gore of a boomer shooter. The trailers had gone viral with the force of a digital hurricane, racking up tens of millions of views as gamers marveled at a world where anthropomorphic mice smoked cigars, wore trench coats, and exploded into clouds of ink and bone upon impact. It was supposed to be the indie triumph of the decade, a jazz-fueled, hand-drawn masterpiece that would prove style and substance could coexist in the modern FPS landscape. But within hours of its release, the celebration was cut short by a single number that ignited a firestorm across the internet, exposing a deep, jagged rift between the critics who gatekeep the industry and the players who consume it. What began as a love letter to the golden age of animation rapidly mutated into the most toxic debate of the year, a conflict fueled by accusations of out-of-touch journalism and a bizarre obsession with dairy. This is the story of Mouse PI for Hire, the game that became a battlefield for the soul of indie gaming. The rise of Mouse PI for Hire was a masterclass in aesthetic seduction. In an industry saturated with hyper-realistic military simulators and neon-drenched cyberpunk dystopias, Fumi Games offered something that looked like it had been pulled directly from a dusty projector in a haunted cinema. The scale of the hype was unprecedented for a small Polish studio. Every frame of gameplay felt like a technical impossibility. 2D hand-drawn characters moving seamlessly through 3D environments, all rendered in the flickering high-contrast black and white of the pre-war era.
The protagonist, Jack Pepper, voiced with a gravelly, hard-boiled grit by the legendary Troy Baker, became an overnight icon. By the time the publishing titan Playside Studios stepped in to bring the game to every major platform, including the brand new Nintendo Switch 2, Mouse had transitioned from a niche indie curiosity into a $1.8 trillion cultural phenomenon in the making. It wasn't just a game, it was an event, a middle finger to the polished, soulless graphics of the AAA machine. But the dark underbelly of this success was revealed not by a technical glitch or a broken mechanic, but by the stroke of a reviewer's pen. The spark that turned the release into a conflagration was the now infamous IGN review, which slapped the game with a 6 out of 10. In a vacuum, a 6 is a passing grade, but in the hyper-competitive ecosystem of 2026, it was a death sentence for a project built on such lofty expectations. The controversy didn't stem from the score alone, but the reasoning behind it. The review complained that there were too many cheese references and too many nods to old cartoons, a critique that fans found fundamentally absurd, given that the game was literally about a mouse in a cartoon world. It was a moment of absolute narrative discord, a professional critic penalizing a work for leaning too heavily into its own identity. The cheese debate metastasized across Reddit and X, with memes of the IGN logo being eaten by rats becoming the currency of the week. Beneath the humor, however, was a growing cynicism toward a game's media that players felt had become pathologically disconnected from the fun-first philosophy of the indie movement. The "but" of the story extended even further into the murky waters of modern technology. As the visual fidelity of the game reached levels previously unseen in the genre, whispers of AI usage began to poison the well.
In a world where generative algorithms can mimic any art style with a prompt, the perfection of Mouse's rubber hose aesthetic was used against it. Cynics claimed that no small team could possibly hand-draw every frame of such a complex shooter, accusing Fumi Games of using a digital skin to hide a generic engine. The CEO, Mateusz Michalek, was forced into the defensive, issuing public statements to confirm that the game was entirely handcrafted, a labour of love that required thousands of hours of traditional animation. The accusation alone was enough to scar the project's reputation, highlighting a new dystopian reality where genuine human effort is met with the same skepticism as a machine-generated fraud. We had reached a point where art so good it looked impossible was treated as a crime. Yet, even as the AI rumours were debunked, a more legitimate debate emerged regarding the game's noir identity. Some critics argued that the juxtaposition of whimsical rubber hose physics and brutal M-rated violence was a fractured marriage that didn't quite hold. They saw a game that wanted to be Cuphead in its visuals, but Doom in its mechanics, and they felt the two were constantly at odds. The irony was palpable. The very thing that made the game unique, its tonal whiplash, was being cited as its greatest fatal flaw. To some, the sight of a cartoon mouse getting his brains blown out to the tune of an upbeat swing band was a stroke of genius. To others, it was a shallow gimmick that lacked the narrative weight required of a true noir story. This in-between space is where Mouse P.I. for Hire truly lived, a game that refused to be a simple children's cartoon or a serious detective drama, opting instead to be a chaotic, bloody middle ground. The "this is" climax of the controversy came down to the journalist versus gamer divide, a recurring fever in the industry that Mouse managed to push to the breaking point.
The backlash against the 6-10 score wasn't just about a mouse game, it was about the perception that mainstream outlets were trying to obliterate the joy of gaming with academic, overly serious critiques that ignored the mechanical satisfaction of a good boomer shooter. Players rallied around Jack Pepper, not just as a character, but as a symbol of defiance against a perceived elite that had lost its way. The game's sales skyrocketed despite the middling reviews, fueled by a community that saw the cheese controversy as a badge of honor. It was a retail apocalypse for the critics' influence, proving that in the age of the viral trailer and the independent creator, a single outlet no longer held the power to dictate a game's destiny. In the end, Mouse P.I. for Hire remains a fascinating artifact of 2026, a game that is both a technical marvel and a social Rorschach test. It pushed the boundaries of what an indie team could achieve with traditional animation, but it also exposed the fragile ego of an industry that struggles to handle anything that doesn't fit into a predefined box. Whether you see it as a solid enough shooter with a stink of moldy cheese or a revolutionary masterpiece that embarrassed the gatekeepers, one thing is certain, it changed the conversation forever. We traded the safety of the status quo for a world where a cartoon mouse can spark a global riot. This is the story of the indie darling that became a lightning rod for our cultural frustrations. This is the brutal, ink-stained truth behind the most debated game of the decade. This is the story of Mouse P.I. for Hire.